Hey guys, this is Dr. Hurd, and I'm here again for another quick PowerPoint on British literary history. This is the second time I've had to do this. The first time it just had static on there, so hopefully you can hear me. Okay. So, the Romantic period is a short period. It ran from 1798 to 1832. I know that sounds like it's only like 34 years, right? But there was a lot that happened during this time in history that contributed to sort of the overall climate that created this new section of writers. I've talked about before, like the Romantics are kind of at the elbow, a little bit at the elbow. The Renaissance was kind of like that, right? We saw a political and spiritual change and shift in direction. In the Romantic period, we see sort of another sort of socioeconomic shift, really, not as much as spiritual as we do sort of seeing, well, somewhat spiritual, and a lot of the socioeconomic changes between the poor and the rich. We really see that a lot here. So one of the major things that happened during this time was the French Revolution. Vive la Révolution. So in July of 1789, the Bastille, which is where they put political prisoners and people who didn't line up with the ideals of the aristocrats, free thinkers, if you will, were placed in the Bastille, and there was a democratic mob that got them out, and they were released from the grip of King Louis XVI, and that's how the French Revolution began, basically with busting into a prison and taking all these free-thinking prisoners. The mantra kind of the French Revolution was liberty, fraternity, and equality. So France had a new constitutional monarchy, which limited the powers of King Louis, thank goodness. The people established a new government with a document named Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which heralded these principles. And if you're observant, you'll probably notice that other places in the world, people were breaking free from old monarchies, say, I don't know, the colonies, the American colonies. They were breaking free from sort of the powers of King George and Britain, and declaring themselves a new and independent nation with a document called the Declaration of Independence, right? So this was not a new or isolated thing. These are things that are happening a lot within culture, different cultures, and throughout the world internationally. But what happened was that when people get very bloodthirsty, when they get a lot of power, and then there's a power shift, there's a lot of instability. So in 1792, France declared war against Austria and Prussia. A group, I don't know if you guys watch Outlander. They talk about the Jacobins and Outlander. Anyway, it was a group that seized control of the French legislature, abolished the monarchy, and declared France a republic. Now, while that sounds good, again, there was a lot of instability politically, and that instability can lead to a lot of issues. So mobs attacked many of the aristocrats and priests. If you were affiliated at all with King Louis XVI, you were murdered. You were just taken out and murdered, as the picture shows here. Even if you were considered part of his group or allegiant to him at all, loyal to him, you were just taken out and killed. Who's going to stop you, right? Those were called the September Massacres. This gentleman here is Maximilien de Robespierre, and he began what we now call the Reign of Terror. This happened after King Louis XVI was beheaded. And if you know a lot about world history, you'll know that his his government really just ignored poor people, and people were, the whole let them eat cake thing with Marie Antoinette, right? And people were literally starving, and then they had all this luxury and decadence at the palace, and the distinction, right, the difference was so appalling to people, and that's really what set off the French Revolution. But the Reign of Terror happened under Robespierre. So over the next year, 17,000 royalists and radicals headed to the guillotine, including Robespierre himself, because ironically, usually when you start a huge movement, people start talking about conspiracy theories and assuming, challenging your allegiance and challenging your challenging your motivations to do something. So Robespierre was beheaded, and then voila, a citizen army arose, and they were led by this guy you might know named Napoleon. Now Napoleon, I think they said he was 5'2", and whew, he was fiery, right, to say the least. Just so you know, and this will come in handy also in the Victorians, but a Tory is considered a conservative person, and a Whig, with an H, is considered a liberal. Okay? So Napoleon was now head of the citizen army. So in 1793, France declares war on Britain, and then 1884, he declares himself emperor. Britain was still under a monarchy, and they became nervous seeing citizens rising up against the monarchy. Again, if it happened in France, it can happen here too, right? If it happened in the American colonies, it can happen here too, right? If people don't like their position, they will get mad and push back. So William Pitt of the Tory government banned public meetings, forbid discussions outside of the Parliament buildings, and removed certain basic rights. So the Conservative candidate was very worried about people meeting together, having meetings, right, and sort of congregating and conspiring together. So he just banned all that from happening, which only makes it worse, as we all know. And they could still meet and do things. So the English fought back against Napoleon's army, and they defeated the French at the Battle of Trafalgar. If you ever go to London, go to Trafalgar Square. It's a huge open square with a super tall, skinny monument with a guy on a horse on the top, and that was built in honor of their victory over the French. But the final straw sort of came at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. You see a lot of this in the Romantics specifically. That was kind of the war that defined them. The Prussian army actually ended up helping the Brits on that one. They arrived a few hours late, but they arrived kind of just in time because the British army was getting a little tired. The Prussians kind of showed up offside and surprised the French, and that was one of the reasons why they won. Napoleon finished his military career at that point. In the meanwhile, Lord Wellington, who was an Irishman who led the army, was crowned with the victory and became a national hero. Napoleon was sent to Elba, the island of Elba, at this point, and remained there for the rest of his life until he died. When he did die, they supposedly ordered his body back and opened up the casket to just make doubly sure that was him and not some other guy. Napoleon didn't, bounce and go somewhere and take off and fool everybody. He was him. He was dead for sure. Okay, it was happening. But as we've already seen, right, in the Renaissance, you take a leader, you got King Louis XVI. You take him, and then you take that leader down, and you replace it with someone else, like Robespierre, and he turns out, and then you replace him with Napoleon. It's like, no leader is quote unquote better than the other leader. Sometimes they're they're not an improvement at all on the former leader, right? And we saw this already in the Renaissance when they, in Restoration, where they took Charles I, chopped his head off, right, just like they did with King Louis XVI, and then replaced him with Oliver Cromwell, and then he sucked, kinda. So then they eventually asked Charles II to come back. It didn't work in Britain, right? And it didn't work in France either. So eventually, here's, if you ever go there, check out the Wellington Arch. Beautiful, beautiful statues there. You can't actually go to the Waterloo Battleground. I've never been there, but Wellington, they built a big hill with a lion on top of it, and Wellington said they've spoiled my battlefield. He did not like it. But if you ever go to London, please do if you ever have the opportunity. There's the ubiquitous cranes, because they're always doing work. They're always doing work in London, whether restoring or building, usually restoring. But so many beautiful, beautiful, beautiful places there in London. So this brings us to the roots of the Industrial Revolution. We talked about a little bit about, in the neoclassical age, the development and the popularity of farming, agricultural technology, which kind of did away with farm workers. So a lot of them migrated to the cities because that same technology that made them lose a job in the country were actually increasing jobs in the city, because they were filling factories full of these machines and they need people to work them. So a lot of these people migrated, and we'll talk about more about this in the Victorian period, into slums, what are now sort of known as slums, and we're working in factories. The first thing, though, that happened was that we didn't have any regulations, because this was all brand new. There really had never been like a factory like this before. People would just, usually if you were a blacksmith, you did that. If you were a chimney sweeper, you did that. That became your job. So you didn't have this, big place that just had a bunch of machines in it that could, you could just have people work there. That was kind of a newer concept. The industrialized world was brand new. So company owners were really bad. They ignored the poor working conditions. They assigned long hours. I think some of these people were working as many as 20 hours a day. And most of them suffered, and a lot of them even died. People got stuck in the machines. There was something called the Blue Book, which sort of emerged during the Victorian period, which we'll talk about next. But it was basically like a factory, information type thing that sort of talked about the years, industrial, progress and stuff. In it, they would also talk about, the condition of the workers. So we have records where people were dying, getting caught in machines. We have one that was specifically what Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Victorian poet, read and moved her to write about child employment, child labor. Was about a child who his arm got stuck in the machine and they had to chop the arm off. Or whether that or the fan chopped it off for him. But anyway, his arm got stuck in the machine, and so he was let go. Couldn't work a job anymore, and he was crippled. Right, he didn't have a limb. So that was and he was let go without any severance or any responsibility from the company itself. This was because there was a movement called the laissez-faire movement. It's French for let them do as they please. And that was basically where the rich and the people who owned these factories were kind of taking a Pontius Pilate, washing their hands of the employees. And so they felt like they didn't have a moral obligation to protect or keep them safe, because hey, if this guy dies or if something happens to this person, I've got a line of people out here waiting to replace the guy, right? What happened unfortunately, is that they just they just didn't care. They stopped caring for the workers themselves. And eventually what happens later in 1833, right at the beginning of the Victorian period, is that we have legislation against child labor and legislation which, thankfully, lays down some rules and regulations for shifts at jobs and sort of limited the working hours and the working conditions. There are stories of workers talking about how they couldn't even leave to go to the restroom. They had to set a bucket next to their machine, and they would just use the bathroom while they were working. They, had to figure that out. Couldn't leave their workstation. So it was just really awful, inhumane. So in the beginning, there was just a lot of just improper care for the workers, which is why the Luddites showed up. They're such a fun little bunch. I've done some research on the Luddites. They're a lot of interesting bunch. So they're an underground organization that fought for better working conditions in factories. The term Luddite means machine breaker. So in 1811, this group, led by the mysterious King Ned Luddite, we think that guy probably didn't even exist. They just made up a fake guy. They made a fake leader so that they would look after this mysterious person who was really more metaphorical. And they helped lead a rebellion of smashing machines in protest to bad working conditions. However, they were slowly overpowered by the British government and eventually smothered out in 1817. As you can probably guess, a lot of the factory workers were with local law enforcement and politicians and lawmakers. And if you were found to be associated with a Luddite, you were usually punished to the full extent of the law. There are actually stories of people being publicly hanged for breaking a machine. So literally just taking a taking a mullet. Oh, Dr. Hurd. Taking a mallet and going into a factory and just busting up the machines, which would, of course, stop production, which would cost money, which was, they thought, well, let's hit them in the pocketbook, right? Let's hit them where it hurts. But of course, again, with all the public, with all the public hangings and stuff, they eventually stopped. So there are going to be 6 people we talk about in this very short section. Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge are the first bunch, and then Keats, Shelley, and Byron are the second bunch. And they're sort of in order there. I've put them in order as you can see them. As you can tell, a lot of the romantics like to be painted with a hand on their face. They thought it was, it showed them in contemplation. Poor Wordsworth up here, he kind of looks like he's, late on his electric bill or something. I don't know. He looks pretty stressed out. Keats, there are several pictures, paintings and so forth of Keats, and Keats is always doing this. He's always studying. He's always in this sort of mode where he's studying, and Keats was brilliant. Only died at 25, I think, and he just, we would have a lot more from him if he had lived longer. Shelley is the husband of Mary Shelley, whom we're going to talk about for Frankenstein. Got kicked out of Oxford for writing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, which he basically wrote just to antagonize a lot of people. Byron here, who's right under here, he was a brilliant guy. Was eventually exiled for many things, but probably most likely that he was pretty outspoken. He was also bisexual, so that didn't bode well among super religious people. Supposedly, the saying goes that he was told he couldn't bring a pet to Oxford, so he brought a bear the first day. That's an old story. Byron was eventually Byron was eventually, we'll talk about his daughter here in a second, but he was eventually exiled. So aspects of Romanticism that we're going to talk about, this will be particularly helpful as you do the discussion boards. The child's sense of wonder, again, it's sort of returning back to sort of optimism. There's a lot of discussion about God and, sort of turning into having awe, AWE, which I can't say right because I've got my Appalachian twang in there, but awe and wonder, I guess. Sort of seeing things in a new light with enchantment, right? Having this sort of enchantment about the way they see things. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were also fans of the Romantics. So a lot of their work is inspired by the work of the Romantics. Social idealism. As you can imagine, if you're in a time of life in community, in international politics, where finally people who have been ignored, neglected, and disenfranchised are getting a voice, right? You've got people who are declaring their independence and people who are pushing back against oppressive tyrants and all this. All of a sudden, you have this sort of idealism about, you know what, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can do that. Maybe that's something that I actually can do. I can contribute to this. So there was this optimism about being able to change your circumstance and to be able to, to sort of grasp your destiny. And the Romantics, I think Wordsworth particularly, went to France some, and actually had a mistress there. I think he might have had a child out of wedlock, but I'm not 100% sure. I can't remember at the moment. But he actually paid visits often to France during the Revolution because he just lapped it up. He just, all of this spirit of independence and renewal and, all this before in the Reign of Terror specifically, he thrived on it. And of course, I had adaptation to change. Obviously, a lot of things are changing during this time, both economically, spiritually, politically. So that's sort of part and parcel of the spirit of the Romantics. A couple of quick things. Again, the child's sense of wonder. We're looking for situations where people are looking at nature or looking at specific situations and seeing God in it, seeing like a transcendence almost in it, a beauty in it that seems just extraordinary, very different. So if we take, like, for example, Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, we're going to read. They're paired poems. One of the poems is told from the child's perspective and the other is told from the adult's perspective. We're going to read The Chimney Sweeper and sort of see how those two poems contradict one another, really, illustrating the difference between the child who has this sense of wonder, this sense of optimism, this positivity, in contrast to the adult's perspective, which is very pessimistic, which is, weighed down, and things like that. So, Wordsworth wrote Intimations on Immortality, which we will read, where he talks about his youth and sort of the beauty of his youth and times that were spent. So again, there's a sense of wonder that you can restore this. Sorry, it's so cold in here. My nose is freezing. There's almost this. It's a sense of wonder, but it's almost like you have this new perspective, this new way of looking at the world that you hadn't really considered since you were a child, and you bypass, the sort of critical and, dare I say, rational aspect of your psyche, and you just go back to enjoying and being in the moment, and right, and you don't have to analyze everything. You just sort of let it hit you and enjoy it. So the term romantic, just so you know, refers to the view of the cyclical development of human societies, a stage when people need to question a tradition and authority in order to imagine better. Definitely, with the U.S., with the colonies just breaking free and establishing their independence, and the French Revolution happening. Yes, we're at a time when you can think differently, and it may happen. Right? It's not just a pipe dream. The Romantics particularly turned toward nature as a deity. So that technically is called pantheism. Pantheism, and again, theism means God, right? Monotheism is one God. Monotheism is one God. Polytheism is multiple gods. And pantheism is nature. So Emerson and Thoreau and some of the Americans from the Transcendentalist movement, it's kind of America's version of Romanticism. They were more sort of leaned toward pantheism. I can say Wordsworth and Coleridge specifically were more about God in nature, not God as nature, right? But God is in nature. So they would go out and nature as in sort of God's unspoiled, raw wilderness. So a lot of it takes place in the woods. There's this great story about Wordsworth stealing a boat. He talks about it, he wrote about it. Wordsworth steals this boat in the middle of the night and paddles out into the middle of the lake. He's from the Lake District, which is gorgeous. I went there several years ago. And he kind of has this like a religious experience. He feels like, all the fetters of like humans, all the stuff that humans have made and destroyed and done, like all that was at that night, at that moment, he felt like he was almost in conversation with God, because he's in this lake and this beauty under this night sky, and so he was just very overwhelmed by this transcendence. And then he was like, yeah, but I shouldn't have stole this boat, so, but still, it's really interesting. But yeah, really, they believed that God was in nature, not that nature was God, if that makes any sense. Finally, we're back to Ada Byron. Here, we talked about her dad a few minutes ago. Ada Byron is actually one of the people who were first responsible for making the first computer. Of course, it's a very, very primitive computer. It's nothing like an iPhone or anything like that. But Ada Byron specifically, again, really interesting situation because if you're into historical fiction, I think Jennifer somebody wrote a historical fiction book about her a few years ago. I haven't read it yet. But she's super interesting because Byron is her father, and Byron, again, was well known to be a womanizer and all this stuff, have all these affairs and everything. And Ada's mother discouraged her from being literary because her dad was literary, right? Her dad was a literary person, so she wanted to steer her away from that life. So she steeped her in math and science. And boom, what happens is she becomes one of the first computer creators. Pretty neat. So finally, our last slide here, this is Mary Shelley. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft that we talked about in the neoclassical age. Her husband is Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom we talked about earlier, the Necessity of Atheism guy. And basically, Frankenstein, so the impetus of that book was that she, Percy, and Lord Byron were vacationing somewhere, and so one of them said, "Hey, let's write a ghost story. Let's write some sort of horror story." And so Mary Shelley's contribution was Frankenstein. Pretty neat. And she has we're going to read her 1831 introduction, which is sort of seen right now as the definitive edition of it, with retaining all of her original work. But she published it, completed it by the age of 20, and published it and became one of the masterpieces of literature ever. Still well known and read to this day. Lots of really cool romantic echoes and resonances in that book. So that's all for the Romantics. I will, if you have any questions, just hit me up, cheard@bvps.org, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.